I never thought I'd find myself working the graveyard shift at Riverwood Mall, but desperate times called for desperate measures. The recession had hit our small town hard, and this security job was the only thing keeping a roof over my head. Most nights were uneventful, just me, my flashlight, and the endless echoing corridors of this dying retail establishment. The first strange incident happened during my third week. I was doing my regular rounds through the old Macy's space when I noticed something off about the mannequins in the women's department. Earlier that night, they had been arranged in their usual poses, frozen mid-stride, hands on hips, heads turned at calculated angles. But now, one of them was facing the wrong direction, its blank head turned toward the service corridor. I reported it to my supervisor, but he dismissed it as the cleaning crew messing around. I wasn't convinced. The cleaning staff hadn't been scheduled that night, and the service corridor led to the abandoned loading dock, an area that had been sealed off after a series of break-ins last year. As I examined the floor more closely, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Wet footprints leading from the mannequin to the service door. I spent the next few nights reviewing security footage. The cameras in that section were old and grainy, but I needed answers. That's when I noticed a pattern. Every third night between 2:15 and 2:30 a.m., there would be a brief power fluctuation. The screens would go dark for exactly 47 seconds. When they came back on, something in the store would be slightly different. A rack moved, a mannequin turned, a display rearranged. My research led me to newspaper archives from the 1980s. Riverwood Mall had been built on the site of an old clothing factory that had burned down in 1979. The fire had started in the loading dock area, trapping dozens of workers in the basement. The official death toll was 23, but local rumors suggested that several undocumented workers had never been accounted for. I dug deeper into the factory's history. The owner, Marcus Thorne, had been cutting corners on safety regulations. The emergency exits had been chained shut to prevent theft. When the fire broke out, the workers in the basement had no escape route. Thorne served just 5 years in prison for criminal negligence. The mall was built 3 years later, using part of the old factory's foundation. Last night, I decided to investigate the sealed loading dock. The master keys from the security office opened the service corridor, revealing a maintenance tunnel that led to the old basement level. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something acrid that reminded me of burned fabric and plastic. What I found in that basement changed everything I thought I knew about the mall. Behind a false wall, partially hidden by decades of debris, was an intact section of the old factory. Rows of rusted sewing machines stood like silent sentinels. Scattered around them were personal belongings that had never been recovered. Photos, lunchboxes, a child's drawing pinned to a moldering corkboard. But the most disturbing discovery was the emergency exit. The chains that had trapped those workers were still there, fused to the door handles by the heat of the fire. Next to the door was a time clock, stopped at 2:17 a.m., presumably when the power had failed during the fire. Everything made sense now. The power fluctuations, the moved mannequins, the wet footprints, they always happened around 2:15 a.m., just minutes before the time shown on that basement clock. Someone or something was trying to tell the true story of what happened that night. But I wasn't prepared for how far they would go to make sure the truth came out. I spent days mapping the basement layout against the mall's current blueprint. There was a significant discrepancy. A large section of the old factory basement didn't appear on any official mall plans. When I brought this to the attention of mall management, I was told in no uncertain terms to drop it. The next day, I found an envelope on my desk containing newspaper clippings about other security guards who had quit suddenly over the years. 2 nights ago, the pattern changed. Instead of just moving, the mannequins began to fall, their plastic limbs arranged in positions that mimicked the victims of the fire. Each morning, the store staff would reset them, only to find them fallen again the next day. The district manager blamed me for not preventing vandalism, but the security footage showed no signs of tampering, just those same 47-second blackouts. Yesterday, I received an anonymous email containing scanned documents from the original fire investigation. They revealed that Marcus Thorne had known about the faulty wiring in the basement for months before the fire. He had also increased his insurance coverage just weeks before the tragedy. The official investigation had missed these details, or perhaps they had been deliberately overlooked. Tonight is my last shift at Riverwood Mall. I've compiled all the evidence, the photographs, documents, blueprints, and security footage, and sent copies to local news outlets and law enforcement. The truth about what happened in 1979 needs to come out. Not just for the 23 official victims, but for all those who were never counted. As I write this, it's 2:14 a.m. The mannequins in every store have turned to face the service corridor. Water is seeping under the doors of the loading dock, despite it being sealed for years. The air smells of smoke and burned plastic. In 47 seconds, the power will go out, just like it has every third night. But this time, I know what message they're trying to send. It's time for the truth about Riverwood Mall to finally see the light of day. The Big Mart distribution center stretched out before me like a concrete maze. As the new inventory specialist, I was responsible for tracking millions of dollars worth of merchandise across 200,000 square feet of warehouse space. The job seemed simple enough: monitor stock levels, investigate discrepancies, and maintain accurate records. I had no idea that accepting this position would lead me to uncover one of the largest organized retail crime operations in the state. It started with small inconsistencies in the numbers. Items would show up as in stock but couldn't be located. Other times, we'd find excess inventory that wasn't logged in the system. At first, I chalked it up to typical warehouse inefficiencies. But when I started cross-referencing serial numbers, I noticed a disturbing pattern. High-value electronics were being replaced with convincing counterfeits. The morning crew would receive shipments through the main loading dock, but there was also a secondary dock that was only used during peak seasons. Security cameras covered both areas, but I discovered periodic gaps in the footage, always on Thursdays between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. The gaps weren't from technical glitches. Someone was deliberately turning off the system. I started documenting the patterns. Specialty electronics would arrive in Monday's shipment, get logged into inventory on Tuesday, and by Friday morning, they would be replaced with knockoffs. The counterfeits were sophisticated. Same weight, same packaging, even the same serial numbers. Only a detailed inspection would reveal the difference in build quality. Working late one night, I accessed the security office computer. The footage deletions weren't showing up in the system logs, meaning whoever was responsible had administrative access. Only 3 people had that level of clearance: the head of security, the warehouse manager, and the regional director. Each deletion coincided with the manager's overnight inspection rounds. Further digging revealed that our warehouse manager, Robert Chen, had worked at 3 other distribution centers over the past 5 years. Each facility had reported similar inventory issues during his tenure, but no investigations had ever turned up concrete evidence. He always transferred to a new location before any formal audits could be completed. The shipping manifests told an interesting story. Certain delivery drivers were assigned exclusively to routes containing our high-value shipments. Cross-referencing employee records showed that these drivers had all been hired within weeks of Chen starting at Big Mart. None of them had prior delivery experience, and their background checks were surprisingly shallow. I started following Chen after my shifts. Every Thursday night, he would drive to an abandoned strip mall on the outskirts of town. A white van would arrive around midnight, and boxes would be transferred between vehicles. I documented everything from a safe distance, using my phone to record timestamps and license plates. The operation was bigger than I'd imagined. Chen was part of a sophisticated network that specialized in replacing genuine electronics with counterfeits. The real products were being sold through various online marketplaces, while the fakes were mixed into legitimate retail inventory. The scheme had already cost Big Mart millions in losses and customer returns. The financial trail was cleverly hidden. Shell companies had been set up to handle the online sales, with profits being laundered through a chain of small businesses. Each Thursday night delivery coincided with large cash deposits at offshore banks. The counterfeit products were being manufactured overseas and shipped in through legitimate channels using falsified customs documents. I found their local storage facility by following one of the delivery drivers. Unit 247 was rented under a fake name, but the power consumption data I obtained from the utility company showed patterns consistent with electronic testing equipment. They were using the space to verify their counterfeits before sending them to our warehouse. When I finally had enough evidence, I composed a detailed report and sent it to corporate security, law enforcement, and several investigative journalists. Within hours, I received an anonymous email. Delete everything and walk away. Final warning. My computer had been accessed remotely. They knew what I'd done. That night, I made the mistake of returning to the warehouse to collect additional documentation. The place felt different in the darkness. As I made my way through the aisles, I heard voices coming from the secondary loading dock. Then footsteps. Multiple sets. Getting closer. The emergency exit was on the other side of the building. They had cut power to sections of the warehouse, creating dead zones in the security coverage. I could hear them coordinating through radio earpieces, methodically searching each aisle. These weren't ordinary warehouse workers. Their movements were too precise, too practiced. I realized that Chen's organization had sent professionals to clean up their loose ends. I managed to reach the security office, but the cameras were down and the phone lines were dead. They had disabled the building's internet connection and cell signal boosters. My phone showed no service. Through the office window, I could see flashlight beams sweeping the warehouse floor. They were getting closer, working in a standard search pattern. The ventilation system was my only option. I removed the office vent cover and pulled myself into the ductwork. The metal creaked under my weight as I crawled toward the exterior wall. Below me, I could hear them breaching the security office. Someone said, "Check the ceiling." A flashlight beam pierced through the vent slats behind me. I emerged on the roof as flashing lights appeared in the distance. The anonymous email had been traced by cybercrimes, and my report had triggered a multi-agency response. As law enforcement surrounded the building, I realized that Chen's organization had bigger problems than one whistleblowing inventory specialist. The investigation revealed the full scope of the operation. Over 50 people were arrested across 3 states. The counterfeiting ring had stolen more than $50 million in merchandise over the past decade. They had connections to international criminal organizations and had been using the profits to fund other illegal enterprises. Today, I'm still working in retail logistics for a different company and under a new identity. The FBI suggested witness protection after several key members of the organization escaped custody. Sometimes, when I'm doing inventory counts in our warehouse, I still check the security cameras out of habit. In this business, you never know what's really hidden behind the numbers. Second Chance's thrift store wasn't my first choice for a summer job, but as a broke college student, I couldn't afford to be picky. The pay was decent, and the employee discount meant I could build my wardrobe on the cheap. Mrs. Kendrick, the owner, had only one strict rule: never under any circumstances accept returns after sunset. I thought it was an odd policy until I discovered why she was so adamant about it. The trouble started with a donation bin drop-off. 3 large garbage bags had appeared overnight, which wasn't unusual. People often dumped their unwanted items after hours to avoid the required paperwork. The bags contained high-end designer clothes, all women's, all in pristine condition. Each garment still had its original price tag, totaling thousands of dollars. But there was something else. Every item had a small red stain on the inside label. My curiosity got the better of me. I looked up the brands online and found multiple news articles about a string of boutique robberies across 3 states. The thief targeted upscale consignment shops, always hitting them just before closing. Security footage showed a woman trying on clothes but never her face. In each case, the stolen items had been paid for with credit cards belonging to missing persons. I started logging the donations in our system, checking transaction dates against missing persons reports. The pattern was disturbing. Each donation coincided with a disappearance from a neighboring town. The victims were all similar: young, female, fashion-conscious professionals who had recently made large clothing purchases. The red marks on the labels looked increasingly like blood. Mrs. Kendrick caught me researching during my shift. Instead of being angry, she locked the front door and pulled out a thick ledger from under the counter. She'd been tracking similar donations for years. The perpetrator had a pattern: donate clothes, wait 3 days, then attempt to return them after dark. Anyone who accepted these returns was never seen again. The ledger contained decades of documentation. Every few years, the same pattern would emerge in different cities. A boutique would be robbed, women would vanish, and their clothes would appear in donation bins. The earliest recorded incident dated back to 1987, but the perpetrator's description never changed. Mrs. Kendrick had lost her daughter to one of these returns in 1995. We reviewed our security footage from recent donations. The night camera had captured someone dropping off the bags at exactly 3:27 a.m. The figure moved with unnatural precision, never looking directly at the camera. The timestamp showed brief digital distortion whenever they entered the frame, as if the recording system was being interfered with. The police had been investigating for years but couldn't connect the crimes. Different jurisdictions, different time periods, different victims. Nothing officially linked the cases except Mrs. Kendrick's ledger. The detective I spoke with said they'd found traces of a sophisticated identity theft operation. The missing women's credit cards were being used to make small purchases, keeping their accounts active to avoid suspicion. Lab results from the stained labels finally gave us something concrete. The blood belonged to multiple victims, but there was something else: microscopic fragments of preserved tissue that dated back decades. Each sample showed signs of chemical treatment, like someone was deliberately preserving trace evidence as a signature. More digging revealed similar cases from the 1970s and earlier. The methodology evolved with technology, from cash to checks to credit cards, but the core pattern remained. Young women would vanish, their clothes would resurface, and anyone who accepted the returns would disappear. It was like a retail version of a chain letter, but with lethal consequences. 3 days after logging the latest donations, it happened. I was closing alone. Mrs. Kendrick had a doctor's appointment when a woman appeared at the door at sunset. She was carrying one of the designer dresses we'd just put out, complete with our price tag. Her face was hidden by long hair and a surgical mask, but something about her movement made my skin crawl. I remembered Mrs. Kendrick's rule and refused to unlock the door. The woman stood perfectly still for several minutes, then slowly held up a stack of receipts. They were originals from all the boutiques that had been robbed, plus dozens more I hadn't known about. She began methodically pressing them against the glass, one by one. Each receipt was stained with what looked like blood. The security system started malfunctioning. Cameras went offline one by one, and the electronic locks began cycling. She never touched the door, but I could hear the mechanism clicking, trying to open. I barricaded myself in the office and called Mrs. Kendrick. Her voice was urgent. "Don't look at her face. Whatever you do, don't look at her face." The power went out just as police sirens approached. When the lights came back on, she was gone, leaving only the stack of receipts. Each one was labeled with a date and time, future dates, all at sunset. The last receipt had tomorrow's date and our store's name. The items returned section listed one store clerk. The FBI took over the investigation. The receipts provided a breakthrough. The paper contained fibers from every decade since the 1950s, but the ink was all from the same source. They found traces of a unique chemical preservative that had been discontinued in 1957. The same compound was present in all the blood samples, somehow preventing degradation. Second chances closed permanently after that night. Mrs. Kendrick said the store had served its purpose as a warning system, a way to track the murders and prevent more disappearances. The donations still show up in other thrift stores, though. Every few months, I read about another missing person case with the same signature. I still work retail, but only day shifts at major chains with lots of security. Sometimes customers try to make returns near closing time, and I find myself checking their receipts for red stains. The case remains open, but they'll never catch her. How do you stop someone who's been returning death for over 60 years?